Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a joy to see all of you here. I see many faces of faculty and students and close friends of the Center for Catholic Jewish Studies. My name is Matthew Tapey. I am the director, and I'm also an assistant professor of theology here at St. Leo. I teach world religions, and I also teach history and theology of Jewish-Christian relations. I'm really glad to see you here. We have an exciting program today, and I want to start off by thanking many people who make the work of the center possible. So first I want to thank Miss Ann Lennox. Miss Ann Lennox, if you would please stand up and let us recognize you. We also want to recognize the co-founder of the Center for Catholic Jewish Studies, Rabbi James Rudin, who's here today. We also have a number of people to thank that are from our community. First, Prioress Roberta Bailey of Benedictine Sisters is here. So, Roberta, if you don't mind standing. And we also want to thank several supporters of a fellowship program for undergraduate students that we have with us today. These are longtime friends of the Center for Catholic Jewish Studies. First, Monsignor Frank Mouth, if you don't mind standing. Monsignor is also the 7th president of St. Leo University. We also want to welcome Doug and Maureen Cohn, who are here today. And Gail and Paul Whiting. And finally, Miss Linda Taggart is also with us. So we have many friends with us here today to celebrate Catholic Jewish relations, to think about Catholic Jewish relations. And this is one of the things I wanted to just say before we begin, before I introduce our very special guest and the reason why we're here, is that from the Catholic perspective, and from, in particular, the teaching of St. John Paul II, it's an important task of a Catholic university, and I think of the Church, to deeply contemplate and reflect upon the historical event that is the Shoah, that is the Holocaust. I think it's important as our community comes together to think about the reasons why it happened, and to reflect and deeply on it. In fact, John Paul II even says to meditate on the existence of this phenomenon in our historical memory and in the lives of so many people that it touched and that it affected. I'll now move and cut to the chase. We have today with us a very special guest, Dr. Victoria Barnett. Dr. Victoria Barnett is director of the program on ethics, religion, and the Holocaust at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. She is a graduate of Indiana University, Union Theological Seminary, and George Mason University. She is the author of For the Soul of the People, Protestant Protest Against Hitler, and Bystanders, Conscience and Complicity During the Holocaust. Dr. Barnett is also editor and translator of Wolfgang Gerlach's And the Witnesses Were Silent, The Confessing Church and the Jews, and the new revised edition of Eberhard Bethge's Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a biography. From 2004 to 2014, she served as one of the general editors of the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Works, the English translation series of Bonhoeffer's complete works published by Fortress Press. She has written numerous articles and book chapters on the churches during the Holocaust. Her newest books have just been published and are actually in the back of the room for those who might be interested in taking a look at them, and possibly even having Dr. Barnett sign them for you. The first book is called After 10 Years, Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Our Times. It's named after the title of a crucial essay penned by Bonhoeffer in 1942. And it is a reflection on what happened to the German people under Hitler. Another book she recently published is entitled The Collected Sermons of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Volume 2, a collection of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's sermons in English translations, which he preached at various times of the year and in a variety of different settings. So without further ado, would you please welcome our distinguished expert on the churches during Nazi Germany, Ms. Dr. Victoria Barnett.
Thank you so much, Matt, and I want to express my gratitude to Matt Taffy and the Center for Catholic Jewish Relations for the invitation and the honor to be with you today, and especially to thank those supporters of the center who are here, not just for your support of the center, but for coming out on a nice afternoon and listening to a talk about Bonhoeffer. My good friend Robert Erickson, who's a historian and wrote a wonderful book called Theologians under Hitler, which explored the famous theologians who found a way to support National Socialism and Nazi-fied theology, told me a story a few years back. There was a film made about his book, also called Theologians under Hitler, and the filmmaker, when the film was launched, invited a wide spectrum of Christian leaders to a showing, and invited Bob to come and comment. And Bob showed me the list of the people who were in the room, and they included, I don't remember all the names, but they really did include the biggest possible spectrum you can imagine of Christian leaders, from mainline Protestants to Catholics to right-wing evangelical leaders. So you had in this room many people, all of them were Christian, but who had very different and sometimes opposing political views. And I said to Bob, wow, what was that like? And he looked at me and he said, Vicki, every man in the room thought he was Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And there's something to that for those of you who aren't that familiar with Bonhoeffer. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a German theologian and pastor. He was born in 1906, so he was only 26 years when the Nazis came to power. He was a brilliant theologian. He had published or had written his second dissertation by the time he was 23. He studied with some of the leading lights of European theology. He traveled to this country, to Union Seminary, where he studied with people like Reinhold Niebuhr. So when the Nazis came to power in 1933, he was already someone who was kind of on his way. He was trying to choose his career path. Should he be a pastor? Should he be a theologian? He was already recognized as brilliant. He had also gotten involved in the European ecumenical movements, so people like Bishop George Bell in England and Willem Wisselhoeft in Geneva, Switzerland, already knew who this rising star in German theology was. And then Adolf Hitler came to power. And several days after Hitler came to power, Dietrich Bonhoeffer began writing very critical essays about the new Nazi regime, critiques about the new so-called Führer principle, which concentrated all the power in the German government in the figure of the Führer Adolf Hitler. He was an early critic of the Nazi anti-Jewish laws. He began to push his church to speak out against National Socialism, and eventually became part of a group within the German Protestant church called the Confessing Christians. He urged his church to move against those within the church who would seek to Nazify him. There was actually such a group in the German church in 1933 called the German Christian Faith Movement, which was thoroughly pro-Nazi, wanted to Nazify the church. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer became a real force fighting against this group. He went to London out of frustration at the passivity of his church. In late 1933, he spent 2 years there. He returned to Germany in 1935 to teach confessing church seminarians. He worked throughout the 1930s for a certain kind of church and a certain kind of witness in Nazi Germany, which didn't go very far. In 1939, he came to the United States very briefly, thinking he would leave Nazi Germany. Reinhold Niebuhr found him a position and thought that he was bringing this brilliant theologian into the safety of American exile. After 6 weeks, Bonhoeffer returned to Germany, saying that he could not stand overseas and watch what was happening to his country. He said, if we're to have a future after National Socialism, and I want to be part of the people who shape that, then I have to stand through this time with my period. So he returned to Nazi Germany about 6 weeks before the Second World War began. He didn't want to serve in the German military, so one of his brothers-in-law found him a position in German counterintelligence. That in turn got him involved in the resistance circles that eventually tried to overthrow the Nazi regime. Bonhoeffer was imprisoned in April of 1943, remained in prison until the spring of 1945, when he and one of his brothers and two of his brothers-in-law were executed by the Nazi regime only days before the liberation at the end of the Second World War. If that was all that he had done, we would probably know his name. It's a brilliant, it's a fascinating and riveting and very moving life story. But he also wrote some of the most beautiful theology in the Christian language. And it's a theology that speaks to Christians across the spectrum. It's fascinating to me that whether people are evangelical, mainline Protestant, every gradation in between, whether they're Presbyterian, Lutheran, Baptist, what have you, people have often read something by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, very moved and impacted by it. His language of theology, his writing very concretely about what Christians believe and what that means for their life on this earth, it speaks to our time, and it remains fascinating to me that almost 80 or 70 years after his death, that Bonhoeffer has been translated into multiple languages, that Christians in South Korea read him, African theologians have benefited from him, people in South America, and as I said, people from all branches of Christianity. So it doesn't really surprise me that in this room with my friend Bob Erickson, so many people have been impacted by Bonhoeffer and wanted to claim him for their own. One would think, given this reality, and given the fact that the Bonhoeffer Works is 17 volumes, and there are several films about him, there are lots of other books about him, one would think that the story is pretty much set. But what I'd like to do this afternoon is actually push back a little bit on the mythology, not so much to tear him down from the pedestal, because I don't have any dramatic new revelations, but to get us to step back at this point in time and think about what the life of this theologian, this young German, really meant. Because we're at an interesting moment in Bonhoeffer research, if you will. The research and the writing about Bonhoeffer has been impacted since 1945 by the work of his closest friend and student, a man named Dietrich. He studied under him, ended up helping him run the seminary, and after Bonhoeffer's death in 1945, really took up the publication of his works and oversaw much of the work in Germany about him, and worked with people around the world to spread the Bonhoeffer legacy. So the first and second generation of Bonhoeffer scholars, part of that second generation, I would say, knew Bethke personally. He died in 2000, so not that long ago. Knew Bethke personally and were very much impacted by Bethke's vision of Bonhoeffer. When the German Bonhoeffer Works was completed, which I think was the 1990s sometimes, 17-volume work in German, before we had it translated into English, the British historian Andrew Chandler wrote a wonderful little review essay called The Quest for the Historical Bonhoeffer. And what Chandler said continues to fascinate me. I think it's one of the best short comments on the Bonhoeffer mythology to this day. Chandler noted that most of the people who had worked on Dietrich Bonhoeffer were theologians. They were Christians. They entered his life and work through the door of reading something of his theology, finding out more about his life, and then kind of building a picture of Bonhoeffer that really fit their understanding of what had happened under National Socialism. Chandler noted that historians in the decades since 1945 have steadily done more research, done more writing, gotten a very different picture of the story of Nazi Germany and the churches than the story most people had in 1945. And yet the Bonhoeffer story has remained frozen in time, unimpacted by the newer research, unimpacted by these newer and sometimes critical perspectives. And so there are some new things we can learn about Bonhoeffer, not by reassembling the facts of his life so much as by reading this new research and then going back to Bonhoeffer and looking at him through a different lens. And that's what I'd like to talk about this afternoon. One of the things I often tell people at this point is that when I was doing my research in Germany, my first book was a collection of oral histories of people who'd been in the confessing church. So some of them knew Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I was doing my research during the 1980s and taping interviews with these people. And at the point I started my research, Bonhoeffer's name was the one name I really knew. And of course, I had this fascination with Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So everyone I interviewed, I would stop at some point and say, well, did you know Dietrich Bonhoeffer? What was he like? And I was surprised by how many people, these were people who had been pastors in the confessing church, said to me, you know, I never heard of him until after 1945. That's interesting to think about. He was a young man, as I said, he was 26 in 1933. He wasn't a bishop. He wasn't yet a leading theologian. He wasn't yet Bonhoeffer. So where would they have heard of him? The names that they knew in 1933, 34, 35 were the names of the leading theologians, people like Paul Althaus, Gerhard Kittel, or they were the names of major preachers like Martin Niemöller, who was quite well known during the 1930s. But Bonhoeffer, in part because he was just starting his career, in part because he left Germany so often, in part because he got involved in a conspiracy, was really on the margins of where people were as a church. And so they hadn't really heard of him until after the war. This is a sign, one more indication of why maybe we need to step back and rethink Bonhoeffer. So the three big areas this afternoon that I would identify as areas in which new historiography has been done, or there are new perspectives that might give us a new understanding of Bonhoeffer, a new glimpse of what he was about. The first area is the story of the German church struggle, the so-called Kirchenkampf. This was the battle within the German Protestant church between the two groups I mentioned earlier, the pro-Nazi German Christians, the confessing church, which rose up against the German Christians. In the early years after National Socialism, the confessing church was portrayed very heroically. And people who had been involved in the confessing church made a point of telling people that they had been in the confessing church. The Protestant and Catholic churches in 1945 were the two German institutions that the Allied military trusted enough to allow them to be involved in denazification proceedings. That is, the portrait of both churches under National Socialism in 1945 was of having really stood up to the Nazis, of having fought back against it. And the clergy were all too willing to carry this perspective forward. In fact, as we discovered over the decades that followed 1945, the picture was much more complicated. There were indeed figures both in the Catholic and Protestant churches, people like Bonhoeffer, who did stand up bravely, who did oppose National Socialism, who fought back against it. But there were very, very many people in both churches who went along with it. Some of them became Nazi party members. Some of them actually betrayed colleagues. Some of them defended National Socialism. And so the pictures of the churches were more complicated than people had initially thought. In this historiography, Bonhoeffer, of course, stood out as being one of the people who was the clearest, because as I said, he wasn't a leader. And when we look at Bonhoeffer's actual faith journey, and his journey both as a person and as a theologian throughout the 1930s, we begin to see that, not surprisingly for any human being, he was sometimes full of ambiguity. He was sometimes doubtful about what he was doing. There were moments when he maybe should have spoken up, but he didn't. One of the things about working through the Bonhoeffer books volumes, this 16-volume work, one of the things I had to do as general editor was read both the German and the English translation line by line. So I became very familiar with every document in that series. And the last 8 volumes are his papers, letters, correspondence, official documents, organized chronologically. And that gave me a really unique experience of reading Bonhoeffer day by day, 1933, 34, 35, knowing what was going on around him, and seeing where he spoke up, where he didn't, where he was fearful, where he wasn't sure what to do. When you think about it, it's the way human life is. Which one of us, if somebody had the record of our lives for the past 10 years, would be able to claim that one particular day or one particular month epitomized what we had done with that 10 years. And yet we kind of do that with Bonhoeffer. So one of the things that the new historiography on the church struggle shows is Bonhoeffer's slow movement towards certainty. One of the interesting things in his personal papers and his letters is how often he talks about how much trouble he has making a decision, how doubtful he is that something's the right thing to do. One sees this at two key moments, one of which is in 1933. His twin sister had married a man of Jewish descent, a man named Gerhard Leitholtz. Leitholtz's father and brother, his father was a professor, his brother was, I think, a lawyer. When the April 1933 anti-Jewish laws were passed by the Nazis, they lost their jobs. Gerhard Leitholtz's father died 5 days later. There is some evidence that it might have been a suicide. That was what many people did in the spring of 1933, and suddenly they were singled out and pushed out of their careers. The Leitholtzes asked Dietrich Bonhoeffer if he would do the funeral, and he refused. A week later, he wrote the Leitholtzes and apologized and said, "How could I have been so stupid? I'm so ashamed that I didn't have the courage to do this." But it's a very human moment where you see that kind of uncertainty under pressure of not knowing what to do. 1939, when he briefly comes to the United States to the possible safety of exile, he comes over on the ship in June, gets off the ship and goes up to Union Seminary. They're offering him a teaching job, a lecture tour through the United States, maybe a job working with refugees. Bonhoeffer gets off the boat and within 24 hours is beset with doubt. We have his diary from New York, which is published in one of the volumes, and you see day by day how he wrestles with his conscience, both because he's left his family, he's worried about them, but also because he's left his students. He's just spent 4 years of his life training young men to be ministers in a confessing church at a time where, for all they knew, they were going to be ministers in what was the beginning of the 1,000-year Reich. Nobody knew that Nazi Germany was going to be defeated. And so he's training these young people very conscientiously about how to be Christian in a totalitarian state, how to be Christian in a state like Nazi Germany. And he's mentored them, he's written to them, he's nurtured them, he's sent them out into the world, and then he got on a boat and went over to New York City, where he's safe, but they're not. The summer of 1939, he knows that they're going to be drafted. He knows that there's going to be a war. He knows that they're going to end up fighting. And so he really, you see him wrestling with this in the diary, and within a week and a half, he's made the decision he has to go back to Germany. Another example of the very human aspect of Dietrich Bonhoeffer in terms of his uncertainty in the church struggle. The second area where I think there's been a lot of new critical research and certainly critical challenges is about with the question of Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the Holocaust. People assume, given Bonhoeffer's heroic journey, that he was motivated purely out of his concern for the persecution of the Jews, that he rescued Jews, that he was one of the people who entered the conspiracy, the resistance, because of what the Nazis were doing to the Jews, that this was the main battle that Bonhoeffer was fighting. In fact, there's very little evidence to suggest that. It's not front and center of his concern. He does help people who come to him for help. We have the records of about 20-some people who were helped getting visas or getting out of Nazi Germany. Many of them baptized Christians, incidentally, people of Jewish descent who had converted. One of the big questions for historians is understanding how the church treated such people who were baptized very differently from members of the Jewish community or from secular Jews. Because even the confessing church, while it was very often willing to speak out for people who were in the church who were baptized Christians and now affected by the racial laws, even the confessing church refused when it came to the Jewish community itself, or the secularized Jews. And so the question arose about Bonhoeffer. What did he really do? Was this really one of his primary motives? Or was his motive to create a different kind of church? Adding to that challenge is a 1933 essay he wrote called The Church and the Jewish Question, which is an incredibly complicated essay. On the one hand, It's a brilliant Lutheran deconstruction of why the Nazi state is not a legitimate form of leadership. You can see the seeds of Bonhoeffer's resistance in that 1933 essay. He's explaining that it's not a legitimate form of authority from a Lutheran perspective, because Adolf Hitler and the Nazis are persecuting a minority. That renders them illegitimate. They're not exercising their state power as God intended them to do so. And then right smack in the middle of this essay is one of the most anti-Jewish paragraphs that you can find in the literature of that era. If you wanted Christian anti-Semitism distilled into one paragraph, this is it. I'll read it to you. The Church of Christ has never lost sight of the thought that the chosen people of quotes, which hung the Redeemer of the world on the cross, must endure the curse of its action in its long drawn-out suffering. He then quotes Luther, and he says, the history of the suffering of this people that God loved, punished, will end in the final homecoming of the people of Israel to its God, and this homecoming will take place in Israel's conversion to Christ. So you have the deicide charge, the so-called Christ-keeper charge. You have supersessionism. You have the argument that the Jews are suffering because they still need to convert. It's an incredibly offensive paragraph, and in the shadow of the Holocaust, one can't read it without really cringing and think, what is that doing in this essay? It's complicated further because we don't know what it's doing in that essay. There are 3 versions of this essay that we have from Bonhoeffer's own hand. None of them have this paragraph in it. The last version that we can date is the one that the publisher sent back to him after he submitted it to a publication. He gets sent back to him, and between that time and the final date of publication, this paragraph finds its way in there. So there are a lot of things we don't know about this. I've done research on it. Nobody has been able to figure out. Did the publisher say to Bonhoeffer, listen, we need something theological in there? Did somebody else write it with him? Why did Bonhoeffer decide to put it in there? We don't know. But it is an example of why Bonhoeffer is so problematic in post-Holocaust theology and in post-Holocaust circles. And as I said, elsewhere in his writing, there's actually very little mention of this as a motif in his motive for his actions. His focus throughout the 1930s really is trying to push his church to be the kind of church that can stand up to National Socialism. What complicates it further, however, is that Bonhoeffer comes from a family that largely supported the Weimar Republic. They were very outspoken in their criticism of Adolf Hitler. His brother-in-law, Hans von der Nani, helped rescue a group of Jews and has been recognized by Yad Vashem. We know from the records of the family that there's actually a great deal of activity in the background, and so was Bonhoeffer part of that, or does he at least reflect those values? These are the kinds of things that still are worth studying and pondering, but it shows that there's some open questions with regard to Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And finally, the big question, Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the resistance. He is murdered, as I mentioned, in April of 1945 for his role in the July 20th conspiracy to overthrow the regime. The plans for that conspiracy included the assassination of Adolf Hitler and the leading Nazis, the installment of a new government. One of the things the conspiracy did was meet with numerous circles of people who could really move in once the government was overthrown, so that you would actually have somebody waiting to become Minister of Defense, Minister of Education, and so forth. The conspiracy was trying to make peace deals with the Allies so that once they overthrew the government, the Allies would stop the war, they could have a cessation of the war, and they could work out a special peace agreement with the Allies. It's an incredibly complicated group. The big question that is often asked about Bonhoeffer's role in the resistance, especially I would say in Christian circles, is how could a Christian clergyman and someone who throughout the 1930s actually wrote a great deal about pacifism, how did he get in with a group of people who were planning to assassinate about 30 leading Nazis, including Adolf Hitler? Now, the mythology about Bonhoeffer, what I call the Bonhoeffer stage and screen, tends to exaggerate Bonhoeffer's role in this conspiracy so that they actually kind of have him laying the bomb or pulling the trigger or being the one who's going to assassinate him. That's simply not the case. He's brought in, he's one of about 6,000 people somewhere in this broader network of conspiracy circles. His role is central in that he's related to several figures by family who are very central in the conspiracy, including Councilman Donati. So he knows what's going on. Debate has arisen, did Bonhoeffer really approve of killing Hitler to overthrow the government? Weren't there other possibilities? Couldn't they have taken him prisoner? And the evidence from the family records is that he did agree that this was going to be necessary to get rid of the Nazi government. There were a number of plans to overthrow the government beginning in 1938. So there's a series of plans and attempted assassinations that don't come to fruition before the final attempt in July of 1944. But Bonhoeffer knows of all this, and as far as we can tell, approved of the plans in general. But the big question that never gets asked, but is now coming out more as the historiography on the Holocaust begins to expand, is we're beginning to take a new look at the different conspiracy and resistance circles in Nazi Germany. There were a surprising number of people, not the majority of Germans certainly, but throughout Germany, throughout the 1930s and 40s, who get engaged in some kind of resistance or rescue activity. They hide Jews. They falsify papers. There's an underground network that actually manages to help some Jews escape to Switzerland. There are other circles that get together to talk about how to overthrow the Nazis that aren't involved in these larger circles. There's the White Rose group in Munich, a group of common students who were simply so outraged that they printed up a bunch of pamphlets, nailed them to the trees in Munich, and said, Germans, our government is engaging in mass murder. We've got to rise up and do something. They were just full of fervor. They felt that people had to finally stand up and say something. And they were found by the Gestapo and, of course, executed. So you have this broad spectrum of people. Bonhoeffer is certainly not the only one. But the resistance circles with which he became involved, the July 20th conspiracy to overthrow the regime, was arguably the most complicated group of conspirators he could have gotten involved with. Because these were people who were in a position to assassinate Adolf Hitler and kill the other Nazis. The only people able to do that were high-ranking generals, high-ranking officials. And they were high-ranking because they had pursued their careers through the 1930s. They had fought for Germany in the early years of the war. Some of them had been involved in war crimes. If they had survived, they probably would have been tried at Nuremberg. In other words, these are Nazis who at some point fled. What do we do with these people? How do we look at them? How do we evaluate their motives? With that broader conspiracy, I think there's also this tendency to portray them as brave anti-Nazi Germans who rise up against the regime. But the fact is that most of them had cooperated with it and gone along with it until they decided to turn against it. And this is the bunch that Dietrich Bonhoeffer finds himself in through virtue of how resistance. So he's surrounded by these people who are morally very ambiguous figures. And the problems of that for a theologian, I think, are equally, if not more, not greater, than this question of whether you use violence to overthrow such a his essay After 10 Years, which is a new edition at the back of the room, that's what he writes that essay about. It's written in December of 1942. It's written to the closest friends around him in the conspiracy, and it's simply an extended reflection on what has happened to Nazis and to Germans under National Socialism, how it comes about that people who know better, that people who are raised to know the difference between good and evil, that people who supposedly have conscience, how it happens that people like that get involved in something like the Nazi project. And it's a very powerful reflection in that sense, because he turns the lens on himself. He says, we have been silent witnesses of evil deeds. Are we still of any use? he looks at what happens to people when they make so many compromises that they themselves are tainted. And in that sense, it's a powerful document for the post-war period in Germany, where Germans over the ensuing decades began to really examine what had actually happened in their country. And as we know now, most of them became very involved on some level in it. So the big historical questions that now come up for historians of the Holocaust in the past 10, 15 years involve this level of complexity, moral ambiguity, complicity, and guilt. An example from his time at a Benedictine monastery in Ettel, Bavaria, in the winter of 1942 and 41. This is where he went to. It was a Benedictine monastery. He goes down there to sort of get away from things, and during that period he begins to write his work on ethics. We now know, this is something we've only discovered in the past 10 years, that during his time at Ettel, the Benedictine monks at Ettel had taken in about 40-some forced laborers from Eastern Europe. These were civilians from places like Poland and Ukraine that the German army had simply forcibly removed from the villages, brought back into the Reich, and put to work. And monasteries, households, factories, businesses could go to the German government and say, I need a housekeeper, I need 40 people to work in my field, I need 200 people to work in my factory. And they got those people. That's what happened to the Eastern European forced laborers. They weren't paid. They weren't there of their own free will. The money that was paid to the Gestapo. And the Benedictine monks of Ettel asked for and got 40 of these people. So that during the time Bonhoeffer was writing his ethics, he's in this setting. He went to Ettel to get away from the realities of Nazi Germany, but I think the example shows that in Nazi Germany you could not get away from what was happening. That by the early 1940s, it was so thoroughly permeated German society that there was no way for anyone to step outside of it. And to read his theology through that lens, to understand what it means to live in a society in which evil is being done to other people, and you're not touched by it, but you are, because you're part of it, and you can see it around you. The information about the use of forced labor by church institutions came into light only in the year 2000, after German historians went through the archives and began to note how many church institutions had taken these people. And at that point, both the Catholic and Protestant churches in Germany issued public apologies, they began to pay reparations, they acknowledged what they had done. But 2000, that's a long time after the end of the Holocaust. And it shows, I think, the way in which historiography, research on the Shoah, which has progressed over the decades, where we're finding out more and more that begins to shift our picture. It also opens up different kinds of questions that I think we can relate to today. We too relate to these questions that challenge us. What does it mean to be a citizen or a person of faith in a society when you see things happening around you? How do you react? And that's the historiography that I think enables us or allows us to begin to read Bonhoeffer in a new, and I would argue, much richer way. That we go back and reread his book on discipleship, on ethics, and discover some new things in it. So I think that there's still a lot to learn about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. It doesn't at all detract, I don't think, from acknowledging that this was a person of real decency, real integrity, an extraordinary individual who died much too young. One of my senses, when I worked through the Bonhoeffer works, I went through various emotions as I read the different material. But one of the things that has stayed with me since completing the work is just the sense that if Bonhoeffer had lived after 1945, that he would have been an extremely important voice in that post-war German era in pushing Germans to look more closely at what happened in their country and pushing Christians everywhere to really reflect on the implications of something like this for their understanding of their faith. So I think there's a lot still that we can do with Bonhoeffer. And I hope that I've inspired you all to go and you don't need to buy the entire 60-volume Bonhoeffer list. You can start with something short. but I think that Bonhoeffer remains somewhat of value to read and reflect on. Thank you so much for your attention.
We now have time for question and answer session. So feel free to, if you have a question for Dr. Barnett, don't hesitate to raise your hand, and I'll see how fast I can run across this entire room back and forth to field your questions. Yes, please. Also, we may have a few students getting up for classes and things, so that's why you'll see some of them having to leave.
Hello. You chatted about how to be Christian in the right. How did he do that? What ideals did he give to those individuals at that time?
Right. So during the period, I think this refers to his training as seminarians between 1935 and 39. So he's training them to be clergy. And one of the interesting things of looking through that material is that he really does instill in them a form of daily devotional discipline that is actually quite Catholic. In the history of the German Lutheran Church, you don't find it very often. And one of the charges made against him during the 30s was that he had kind of created this pseudo-Catholic community. But he thought that for these people, they had to find some way each day of reconnecting with their belief, of reconnecting with their conscience. And the second thing that he really emphasized was the importance of community, that they needed to stay in touch with each other. It needed to be an honest community. I mean, this is one of the interesting things about Finkenwalde, was that he also told them they had to make confession, which is a very un-Protestant thing, and make confession to one another. And that they should follow the old rule that you shouldn't say something bad about somebody else in the community unless you're willing to talk with them directly. So he really tried to build this very tight community using kind of a spiritual discipline. So it wasn't sort of a set of political instructions. We're living in the Third Reich, here's what you do politically. It was more, if you want to keep your sense of balance, backbone, and conscience under these circumstances, you're going to have to strengthen that within yourself. And that was really what he put his emphasis on, which is kind of, it was sort of unexpected to me when I went through that part of the works to see how much emphasis he laid on that.
I was struck by the very jarring anti-Semitic paragraph you talked about in the one essay, but you seem to indicate that none of the three versions you had were in his hand. Out of the options that you discussed, though, or mentioned, you didn't seem to say whether the question was whether this was an editorial insert entirely, because it does seem almost very cardboard cutout, straight anti-Semitic script. Doesn't sound like it fit into the rest of the essay very well.
Yeah, he never denied having written. I mean, it was published in 2 places, and he never said, "Whoa, where did that come from?" I mean,
I was curious if he acknowledged
he didn't.
anyway.
And the other thing that's interesting is, so he has been suggested, I think, 3 times as the recognition as a righteous Gentile by Yad Vashem. And each time he's been turned down, and each time this essay has come up. And the last time this happened, the person making the application actually went and tried to find Jews whom Bonhoeffer had known or helped, and did get in touch with a woman named Anneliese Schnorman, who was a Jewish friend of one of Bonhoeffer's sisters. Schnorman had actually helped fund Bonhoeffer's youth work in Berlin. She actually escaped Nazi Germany and ended up working for Anna Freud, and lived to be quite elderly, so she was still around to give the affidavit for Yad Vashem. And I saw this just 2 years ago, and in the affidavit she says that he said to her afterward that he regretted having that paragraph in there. So I think it must have come from him. And theologically, if you look at his theology about Judaism as a whole, through the rest of his theological writings, he's not a post-Holocaust theologian. I mean, he still does, he uses the word Pharisee pejoratively. He hasn't yet repudiated the idea that people have to convert. The closest he comes is during the resistance period during the 1940s. There are a couple of very short pieces. One is a confession of guilt by the church, which he proposes as a confession that the church should make after the defeat of Nazism. And in that confession, there's a line that says, "We are guilty of the blood of the most innocent brothers and sisters of Jesus Christ." And that, I think, can be read as an acknowledgement of the church's guilt. So there are a couple of phrases here and there that you can latch onto. But it's interesting. There's not enough to put the pieces together and say, well, this is 25 on Judaism.
Thank you for spending time.
Anyone else?
I was just wondering, his time when he was with the Benedictine monks and he was writing on ethics, just what their position on, not deploying, but having that labor force there and what he was trying to maybe change about it since they were already such an established facility.
Yeah, so he doesn't write anything specifically that indicates that he is aware of these people being around, although he must have been. And the monks don't say anything. When this came to light, the people at Etel actually did issue a statement, and one of them actually went to try to find survivors of the people who've been there. So there's sort of a chapter in the book that I found in German that looks at the Benedictines' effort to not just give reparations, but to really sort of acknowledge what had happened. But Bonhoeffer's writings on ethics from that period are interesting, and one needs to then think, does he have this in mind? Because he writes about things like the right to bodily life, the right of people to be free. There's a section called History and the Good, where he talks about the twilight that history has cast on good and evil. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in ethics which, when you go back and read it, knowing the historiography, reading between the lines, I think he's really wrestling with the reality of what is happening.
So I'm just wondering about the Catholic Church or other religious facilities. Like, you wouldn't necessarily think about them participating in these practices, but was it pretty common?
This forced labor? Yeah. There were about 6,000 forced laborers in Catholic churches, in institutions like monasteries and convents, as well as places like hospitals, places where they needed people to work. And as I said, the German Catholic Church has acknowledged that. But one of the things that when you get into this history, you sort of look at this kind of thing and you think, well, but somebody could have acknowledged this in 1946. But they didn't. I always say good historians keep the ethicists honest because they document what really happened.
And did they ever try to justify it as, well, they're not in concentration camps, so we're actually maybe sparing them for a while? Or?
So that I don't know. I don't know if there's documentation from the era where you have people, let's say, who are working in hospitals who are realizing what's going on and saying, well, but at least, I honestly don't know.
I wondered, as you were speaking, and you said, as you were I wondered, you yourselves, when did you get into this? Did you start with religion and undergrad, or did you start with learning German?
Well, the question was, how did I get into this line of work? We'll skip my undergrad career, which is about completely other things. But when I got to Union Seminary, I initially was really interested in studying the ideological battles in the Latin American Catholic Church of the Liberation Theology. I did my master's thesis on the Puebla Bishops' Conference, and I went down to Mexico twice. I was an observer. So my big interest, and this is actually what has kept my interest through the years, is, what happens to religion, what happens to people of faith when they are put in these situations of political turbulence, ideological battles. Why do some people take one side and some people take the other side? How do people deal with this theologically as well as politically? And when I moved to Germany, the logical case study to study something like this was the history of the churches under Nazism. And I started actually with a very heroic understanding of the confessing church. I started in 1979 by interviewing Germans who'd been in the confessing church. I figured that they had all known Bonhoeffer, and I figured that they were all like Bonhoeffer, because that was kind of my image of the confessing church. And the very first person I interviewed was a gentleman who was eager to talk to me because he had been a prisoner of war in Kansas, and he wanted to talk to an American. And I still remember mentally thinking, German pastor, confessing church, prisoner of war in Kansas, German soldier. I mean, I just had never really understood the complexities of the era. And by the end of that first interview, I thought, wow, this would be something worth looking into. And that was really what got me started.
Yes, as you were giving your talk and talking about the ambivalencies of his life, I couldn't help but think about Oskar Schindler and the movie Schindler's List. Now, most Americans, when that movie came out, had never heard of Oskar Schindler, and so when the movie came out, we put him up on a pedestal as a great hero, and later research showed that, well, Schindler's life was much more ambivalent than was portrayed, and I guess it's just part of the human condition that if you put somebody up on a pedestal, you're usually going to find they don't fit the image that you originally set for them.
Yeah, and I think also, I agree with that. And another way of saying that is that all of us go through our lives and we make various compromises. And sometimes even at the time we make them, we don't understand the cost. It's a rare person who, in a certain situation, at a key moment, will sort of stop and think, wow, is this the moment where I should do something? One of the people I interviewed for my first book who really was like that was a wonderful woman named Helena Jacobs, who actually has been recognized by Yad Vashem. She was involved in a rescue and resistance circle that helped Jews. Helena Jacobs in 1933 was a college student. And Hitler comes to power, every college student has to fill out a new form that the government issues, which essentially proves that they are Aryan. So they have to go get proof of their background because the Nazis didn't want Jews in college. And Helena Jacobs looked at this form and said, what's an Aryan? There's no such thing as an Aryan. I'm not filling out this form. This is a 19-year-old. And as a result of not filling out the form, she gets kicked out of college. She can't get a job. She ends up kind of working on the margins of society, menial jobs. That's how she finds her way into a circle of people who are helping Jews, because Jews and people helping them are quickly being marginalized. So she doesn't make any compromises beginning with that form. But who in this room would look at a form and say, I'm not going to fill out this form? Just a simple step like that. So, life, especially in dictatorships and times like that, can get very complicated very quickly. And I think realizing that is important when we study the zero.
Hi, I'm James Rudin, one of the founders of the center, and my wife and I spent some time teaching at St. Leo. I hope the folks here at St. Leo realize that Dr. Barnett is, in my opinion, the world's greatest authority on the subject you just heard about resistance to the Nazis, particularly in the religious community. I also hope when you go to Washington, you'll stop by and visit with her. She's on the professional staff at the U.S. Holocaust Museum, which is right next to Constitution Avenue. It's
14th Street.
14th Street, near the Bureau of Engraving and Printing,
Right next to
where the money is printed. But I hope you will go to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, the U.S. Holocaust, and because Dr. Barnett and her colleagues are there. I just have one point to follow up on what she said. And I'm speaking as obviously as a Jew, as a rabbi. I hope you heard what she said. The whole society was completely Nazified or involved or by osmosis with Nazism. That's considered, I consider sports, religion, education, the film industry, radio, there was a television, all youth groups, all films, culture, the economy, all of it, and the religion, as you've heard, was completely dominated and often controlled by the Nazi regime. It's very hard for Americans to understand that, where the government controls all aspects of life and imposes it upon you. The question I have for Dr. Barnett, there's one phrase that I was always interested in when I read what a little I know about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Toward the end of his life, and remember, as she pointed out, he was only 39 years old when he was executed by the Nazis, just a little bit before the end of World War II. So he was a very young man. But he used a phrase, and he put a comment on this, Dr. Barnett, religionless Christianity.
Yeah.
He talked about, I want to say it again, listen closely, religionless Christianity. It seems to be an inner contradiction. So if you would comment on what you think he meant by that, and is that an accurate translation from the German, religionless Christianity?
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you very much for your generous words. And I will repeat his invitation if you come to the museum in Washington. Just ask at the information desk, and I'm up on the 5th floor. And part of my job is working with people and greeting them and answering questions. So I'm always happy. I will always be happy to see somebody from St. Louis. Religionless Christianity is one of the phrases in Bonhoeffer's late writings that really kind of galvanizes the curiosity of the theological world, because it's so intriguing. You know, what did he mean by that? My own thinking about this has changed over the years. Part of what he's saying, and his critique of what he calls religion, in quotation marks, begins back in the 1920s. It's shared by people like Karl Barth. And so what they're distinguishing is religion as a phenomenon as opposed to faith doctrine. I mean, the religion, they're framing religion as something different from simple direct faith. And I think that maybe that's what Bonhoeffer was getting at in the work, his prison letters, which is where he comes up with this phrase. There's kind of an extended reflection that acknowledges that Christianity after the end of National Socialism can't be what it was before. That because of what has happened, something dramatic has changed. Christians can't just keep going to church as if nothing had happened. And so he says we need to find a new language for what we do, something religionless. And then he begins to talk about how being a Christian might, in previous years, it might have meant going through certain rituals. He says now all it means is prayer and the doing of justice. And so he's there are all these little fragments that he doesn't live long enough to put together himself. But what I found myself wondering is if religionless Christianity is simply Christianity boiled down to its essence. I mean, his question, what does it mean to be a Christian? What do you do if you're a Christian? Do you have to have a religion, or do you simply have to follow Christ? Which is what he argues in Discipleship. And I actually increasingly link what he wrote in his book Discipleship, which he wrote in 1936, as being what he meant. That he's talking about when you take everything away, when you get rid of the church, you get rid of all the clergy, the bishops, the hymnals, what do you have at the end of the day when nothing is left? But you consider yourself a faithful Christian. That's Christianity at its essence. And I think that's what he was trying to tease out during that final period in prison. But I might be wrong. And I might change my mind.
I was interested in your comments and your study on supersessionism and replacement theology. Several years ago, I got interested in Jewish roots of Christianity. And I never heard of that. And I don't think most people in a Christian church would understand what you were talking about. Maybe we're starting to, but it goes back to the 5th, 4th, 3rd century of Christianity, and it's like cement in the Christian church, and it's not talked about. And I wonder what Jesus would have done if he lived in Germany at that time.
Rabbi Rudin just said he would have been killed, which is true, because Jesus was true.
And Mary and Joseph. And you know, Jesus was a Jew, and Mary was a Jew, and they practiced Judaism. And Jesus loved Jews, and the church needs to pray for that love for the Jews, because we don't have it. But we're not informed about it. We need to emphasize that we need to love the Jews as Jesus did. And there's a link between Jewish theology or Jewish practice and Jewish history and Christian history is it's very strong. Can you comment a little bit more on supersessionism?
Yeah, well, supersessionism, for people unfamiliar with that phrase, simply is the notion that Christianity has replaced Judaism. That the New Testament replaces the Old, that the Gospel replaces the Law, that Judaism, in a sense, is a religion that is no longer valid after Jesus Christ comes. Those of us who worship Jesus as the Messiah, who consider ourselves, who are Christians, that, as you said, it's very embedded in Christian history because of the early centuries of the church and the breakaway from, the clear break from Judaism. This kind of became the interpretation of the scriptures and the understanding of what it meant to be Christian, and it also very much shaped the church's attitude toward Judaism and Jews. And so it's embedded very deeply in Christian consciousness. I mean, whatever tradition you're from, if you ever sit and go through your hymnal, and you try to identify the phrases in each hymn that are supersessionist, and you take them out, you'd be surprised how many hymns have this. I mean, we sing them every Sunday. We're used to them without, we're used to singing them without thinking about what this is really saying. O come, Emmanuel, ransom captive Israel. These hymns like that, which is very much a part and parcel of the Christian mindset, and that's one of the reasons that I think centers like the one that we have here at St. Leo are so remarkably important. That one of the ways to really address this is to have Christians and Jews in conversation with each other, to really understand the Jewish tradition and its incredible vitality and its beauty and its integrity. And that in turn, I'm blanking out now the name of the famous interfaith leader who said this, but interreligious dialogue well done helps us appreciate our own tradition more, because we learn of the traditions, of the treasures in the other traditions, and you really begin to get a different kind of sense, a different glimpse into your faith. So I think that I hope, I'll plug Matt Tappy's program. I hope you will attend future programs here at the center, because this is the kind of place where these kinds of conversations happen, and they're so valuable. So thank you very much for your words.
Thank you very much. Friends, it's been a very stimulating dialogue. We want to thank Vicki for coming out to be here with us. I want to just make a few points. First, please note that if you are interested in seeing more dialogues and more lectures on these topics and you are from our community, please know that we invite your support and can keep in contact with you through the sign-in sheets out front. If you would please take interest in those sign-in sheets, write down your name, your email address, your phone. We'll stay in contact with you. We certainly welcome any support that can help us continue these programs. Also tonight at 7 p.m., Dr. Barnett will be giving another talk, a separate talk, a different talk at Christ the King Catholic Church on Catholic, Jewish, and Protestant reactions during the Holocaust. So we'll get a bit broader tonight at Christ the King, and Rabbi James Rudin will be there as well to give a response to Dr. Barnett. We will have Rabbi Richard Bernholz of Congregation Share Zedek there as well, giving an opening prayer, so it should be a really interesting interreligious engagement. Thank you all for coming out. It's been a joy, and I hope you have a very good day.